and welcome to Android Design in Action. I'm your host, Roman Nurik.
Hey guys, my name's Adam Koch.
And hi, I'm Nick Butcher.
And today, in our special episode of Android Design in Action, I feel like I say special episode every week, but...
It's because it is a special episode, really.
Yeah, I guess, but this week it's actually a very special episode. We're going to be talking about what's new in Android 4.4 KitKat, which was just recently announced. We're going to talk through a couple of specific changes, a couple of new design guidelines, updates, that all designers should be aware of when planning for Android 4.4 KitKat. So without further ado, let's jump into the content. Okay, so the very first thing that we should probably talk about is the new Nexus 5. As with every platform release for Android, there's usually a lead device, as we call it, I guess, that comes out, and it's kind of the showcase device for that platform release. I think for Android 4.2, it was the Nexus 4 or the Nexus 10? I forget already. And then for Android 4.3, it was the Nexus 7 2013 edition. But anyway, so for Android 4.4, it's the Nexus 5. And the Nexus 5, as you might imagine, is about a 5-inch device. I think it's like something like 4.95 inches diagonally. But here's some of the interesting characteristics that you don't really get from the spec sheet, if you will. These are characteristics that are very important for designers. So the first is that it's 5 inches, so it's a phone. It's very obviously a phone, not really a tablet at all. But next, I think is a very important point here is the screen resolution in density-independent pixels. So as most of you know, anytime you're designing layouts or things like that, you should really be thinking in terms of density-independent pixels rather than just regular pixel units, because that more accurately represents the size of the device, which is very important, obviously, for layout purposes. So the screen size of the Nexus 5 is 640 by 360 dips, and that's actually the same exact screen size in dips as the Galaxy Nexus. It's a little more narrow than the Nexus 4. But that's kind of the screen size there. And then the last bit of information here is the logical density of the device. Now the screen itself is about 440 points per inch or dots per inch, but the logical density, as you guys probably know, we actually use density buckets. The logical density of the device is XX HDPI or 480 DPI. So if you're creating assets now, if you're creating assets for for your apps, you should definitely start thinking about it. And actually, if you haven't already been thinking about it because of other devices like the Galaxy S4 or the HTC One, you should definitely start thinking about XX HDPI as kind of the highest density assets. So before we move on, anything else you guys want to say about the Nexus 5?
No, not really. It's a great device.
Yeah.
The screen is incredibly crisp.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Reading text on the screen is a really, really great experience. It's beautiful. Here's the Nexus. We have a couple of Nexus 5s, but here it is. I'm sure you guys will see it in stores and all that, whatever. Anyway, let's move on to branding. Nick, do you want to talk about branding?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the changes in KitKat is we've really tried to move the system UI into a more kind of neutral tone. So what I mean by that is in prior releases of Android, we often used a very kind of strong blue accent color, which you might have seen in the status bar where your notification icons go, so the signal strength and battery and so forth, as well as the default kind of press state color whenever you touch on any item or radio button checkboxes and so forth. They would have this very kind of like high contrast blue. So the problem with that was that it could very well clash with the branding and the coloring which you were trying to bring to your app's personality. So in Android 4.4, we've really toned back this kind of color palette that the OS uses in order to let the applications stand out and show their own personalities. So the OS really does kind of get out of the way and doesn't kind of impose its own personality within your application. So you'll see this throughout the application. In the kind of the notification icon scheme changing to kind of this kind of muted gray and white color. As well as the change in the default touch highlight states. So yeah, and as before, like the idea of this is really to allow you to bring your own personality to the app. So as we've called out here on the slide, there's some tools out there such as androidholocolors.com, which will help you to kind of marry the holo visual theme, the look and feel of the buttons and checkboxes and so forth, with your own brand accent colors.
I'm having some trouble zooming for some reason, but one of the things that we should probably mention is that there's a new section in the design guide called the Your Branding section. I think it's under /design/style, and it calls out specifically things that you should keep in mind. For example, using your brand accent colors rather than using the default kind of hollow blue everywhere. Use your brand accent colors. One thing I guess that is important to note here is that this has been around for a while. The guidance has always been to try to customize, to try to kind of find the right balance visually between your brand and holo. And color is one of the best ways to introduce your brand. So now we're kind of just formalizing that in the design guide in this Your Branding section. So there's two examples here, I think, in the guide. The first is Google Wallet using the Google blue, red, yellow, and green colors throughout the UI to add some flourishes, as well as the Google Play Music example, which is a very good example of branding, where you see orange basically everywhere replacing stock blue. So as part of this new Your Branding section, at the very bottom, you'll also notice the section on icons. And specifically, it talks about the distinction between, I guess, visual styling and iconography, like, I guess, the actual glyphs or the meanings of the icons. So basically, just to summarize this point here at the bottom, it basically says, when you're coming from other platforms or when you have an existing, I guess, visual style for your icons, make sure that if there's something in the Android icon palette that is universal, for example, sharing or refresh or things like that, make sure that you apply your visual style to Android's iconography. So use the object or the actual icon from Android's palette, but apply your visual styling. So here's an example. So let's say you have these three icons and you have upload, view on web, and share. So iOS 7 recently introduced kind of this new visual styling for that platform, where they basically have kind of outlines as the primary motif, right? Throughout each icon, everything is basically just an outline. So here are some of the icons you may build for, say, iOS 7, and they have a new share icon. It's it looks like this. But when you're taking this to Android, make sure that you don't just blindly copy those same icons, that you apply whatever visual styling you seem or you deem necessary for your app, or you deem fit for your app. Let's say in this case, again, outlines, but still use Android's actual icons. So here's the Android share icon. This is just an example of the Android share icon with the outline motif applied. So this section of the Your Branding design guide pattern or style section really just kind of formalizes that. Just make sure that you are applying this. You're not just blindly copying the exact PNG assets across platforms. And if your visual style is not outlines, if it's something else, if it involves 3D effects or whatever, if that's your if that's your thing, then that's fine, as long as you kind of maintain Android's iconography. All right, so let's move on. Actually, real quick, just to drive the point home. So you wouldn't use something like the top right here on Android for sharing. You'd use something like the bottom right here. Okay, moving on. Touch feedback.
Yeah. So in Android 4.4 KitKat, I think as Nick mentioned before, touch feedback has more of a neutral color applied to it. So when you look at this sort of system UI widgets, you'll notice now that there's sort of this much more neutral color as opposed to this sort of hollow blue that you've become used to. So in this particular case, we see a button, the standard Android widget for a button, and there's a 10% opaque black overlay applied accordingly. And when it comes to implementing your own touch feedback, you should sort of follow a similar kind of guideline. So you should sort of have a more subtle and neutral color tone. And of course, if you're adapting for your own brand and you have a color that sort of matches your brand, you could also apply that when creating your touch feedback. We talked about touch feedback on images the other week, and the same kind of applies there. You can also go with this sort of more neutral, sort of 10% opaque black overlay, or you can apply your brand colors accordingly.
Yeah, so basically anytime you have touch feedback in your app, try to avoid the stock default blue. And actually the default blue, for developers out there, if you just use selectable item background, that is no longer blue. It's actually kind of like a light gray at about 10 or 20% opacity. But the idea is that it should be more subtle, and anytime you have touch feedback, or basically any widget in your app, make sure that it's not using the stock blue, unless blue is your brand accent color. Make sure that it's either something very neutral, like a grayscale tone or something like that, or your brand accents. I think that's the main thing there. Okay, moving on to full screen. So this is actually a guideline. It's under developer.android.com/design/patterns. And this guideline talks about when and how you should present full screen UIs to your users. So there's two modes, two, I guess, approaches that they talk about, and they're called lean back and immersive. So lean back, you guys have already seen before. If you open up YouTube and you start, playing a video, the system UI, the navigation bar, the thing with back, home, and recents, and the status bar, the thing with your status icons and your clock and all that, those kind of fade away, and the full screen is left for the video. It's a truly immersive video playback UI. Now, as soon as you touch the screen, the navigation bar, the thing with back, home, and recents, and the status bar fade in. Now, this is called lean back because generally if you're watching a video, you're not really interacting with the screen, right? You're not like doing stuff in the middle of the screen. You're just sitting back and watching the video. And so as soon as you touch the screen, the bars appear. That basically prevents the app from doing anything else with the screen. Now, or I guess using
interacting with the screen.
Exactly. With immersive mode, this is something that's new in Android 4.4 KitKat. And immersive mode basically, again, hides the bars, but it also allows the user to interact with the middle of the screen. And immersive mode is more suitable for things like games, where you actually need to interact with the screen, or book readers, where you're kind of flipping between pages. Now, the reason that the lean back mode, as soon as you touch the screen, it shows the bars. The reason for that is really because, those bars are critical. Not having access or losing access to back, home, or recent, it can fundamentally break your experience or your usage of the device. And so that's why it kind of consumes that first touch and shows them automatically. In immersive mode, the way in which a user can show the bars is by swiping down from the top of the screen or swiping up from the bottom of the screen. And every time, actually, I guess we'll look at this in a second. Anytime you hide the bars in immersive mode, you basically see this. Actually, no, not anytime. The first time in a specific app that you hide the bars, they'll see this pop-up overlay type thing. And it'll basically say swipe up or swipe down from the top of the screen to show access to your back, home, and recents and stuff like that. So as soon as you swipe down, you'll actually see your bars again. But the idea is that now in this immersive mode, you can use touch events and everything all in the middle of the screen without showing the back, home, and recents, and it's really, really ideal for things like book readers and games and things like that. So we have a full. We're not going to talk in too much more detail on this.
You could demo it.
Yeah, I guess we could demo it. So
this app.
we could swipe. That's not actually going to work because I think we're in a special mode in our Nexus 10. But the point here is that we have. So this is a new mode. It's called immersive mode. We're going to have a dev byte released on this very shortly, and the dev byte is basically going to explain how you actually use these APIs. It's actually very, very simple. It's not a very complicated API to use, but it's very, very powerful. So long story short, if you're building a game or a book reader, magazine reader, anything like that, make sure to check out immersive mode in KitKat.
And you have full control of exiting immersive mode as well. While the system provides those gestures, the swipe up from the bottom or down from the top, but you can also control that. So, for example, Play Books takes over every single pixel. So when you're reading, you get this fully immersive mode. Mm-hmm. But if you tap in a gesture which they always use to show the system Chrome, so the action bar comes back and their kind of like text controls come back. But they've also listened for that tap and restore the kind of system UI as well. So you have full control over this.
Exactly. All right, let's move on. translucent bars. Is that Nick? Nick, you want to talk about translucent bars?
Sure. Yeah. So a slight variation upon this this theme is translucent bars. So this is still showing the system Chrome, so showing the status bar and then and navigation bar at the bottom, but allowing your application to draw to that same real estate with minimal background protection applied over the top. So this is used to great effect by the new home screen, the new launcher application on the Nexus 5, which allows you to show the wallpaper like from edge to edge of the screen while still preserving those system functions. And your application can do the same thing. So if we go on to the next slide to take a look at a sample application of the kind of thing you could build. So here's an application which is using maps kind of as the main UI element, and here you can see that we're extending the content all the way behind the system bars. So it really gives you this immersive feel, but the map is the entirety of the canvas you're drawing to, and you just have this kind of minimal background protection applied, and you can control what is drawn behind the system bars.
So 2 points I wanted to make.
As a slight,
go ahead.
I was going to say, as a slight, not new in Android 4.4, but in a very recent update to the Google Play Services library, you now have the ability to do more with maps, have a little bit more control over the kind of stock UI maps Chrome. So that's things like here we can see the locate me and the zoom in and out button, as well as the kind of orientation compass point. You can now set padding on those controls so that if you do have system UI such as this the action bar at the top and the system bar and buttons at the bottom, or even your own controls overlaying the map, you can now pad them in so they will remain visible despite your other Chrome on top of the map canvas.
Yeah, so I guess my 2 points turned into 1 point I want to make, because that was one of the points I wanted to make. One of the points I wanted to make was the background. There will always be, like you said, there's always some background protection. I think in this first iteration, I guess there will be a gradient. So regardless of what's shown, I guess regardless of what your app UI is, there will always be a gradient, a subtle kind of black to transparent gradient behind both the status bar and the navigation bar. So just keep that in mind if you're designing kind of screens like this. Okay, and also another thing I wanted to mention is we don't really have guidance on exactly how you should use this yet. So this is still kind of, I'd say, in an exploratory phase. One of the things that I know that one of the engineers mentioned was that you should try to avoid using action bars in this case. I think that this translucent bars type of UI is really designed for like wallpapers or kind of wallpaper type apps that really go full bleed with the content. So it's not really quite clear exactly how you should use this yet with other UI Chrome, but definitely this is just one of our early explorations. All right, let's move on to launcher icons.
All right, so for launcher icons, hopefully you're already aware they're normally shown at 48 dips, a square of 48 dips. Now on Nexus 5, due to the new launcher, they're actually shown larger, actually about 25% larger, or 60 dips. And then because Nexus 5 is an XX HDPI device, essentially in order for the icons to show at their crispest, you really need to include an XXX HDPI or 640 DPI icon. Yes, we really just said that. So the actual pixel size of that icon is 192 pixels. And this is somewhat similar to how tablets behaved previously with their launcher. They would actually show the icon slightly larger, and so it needed to sort of dip into the density bucket that's one larger than the density of the actual device. And so I guess our guidance here is, the icon is just so important. It's such an important part of your application. You should really be including an asset that makes it look its best on all devices and all screen sizes. And so that means in this case, you need to provide XXX HDPI icon for the launcher icon.
And so right now this applies to Nexus 5, since Nexus 5 has this new kind of launcher. But you'd imagine that other devices in the future would potentially do something like this. So basically, just kind of get ahead of the game, start including these 640 DPI icons. And also, I mean, just to kind of, I guess, talk about how this works with tablets, right? If there was an XX HDPI tablet, then you'd have to do this anyway. It just happens to be that there's an XX HDPI phone that's now using this tablet scaling behavior for launcher icons. Okay, let's move on to new gestures. So these aren't exactly, I guess, new gestures, but we're kind of formalizing 2 new gestures in our design guidelines. So if you go to developer.android.com/design, I think it's under patterns gestures. I forgot. But you'll see 2 new gestures. The first is an expansion of double touch. And the second is, I guess, double touch to drag. So the expansion on double touch basically says, if you're looking at a photo, right? I mean, or something that's just zoomable, double touch should zoom it in. If you're in something like Google Chrome, oh, like that, right? Exactly. If you're in something like Google Chrome or something else that has kind of bits and pieces of information laid out, and you want to double touch on one of those bits and pieces of information, basically what this is saying is that you should zoom in to that content. So if you're in Chrome and you double touch on a column of text on a web page, it'll actually zoom to fit that column of, of text. So this basically says if you have any other types of, or if you're building an app that is similar in terms of what content it presents and the layout in which it presents that content, this is something that you should do. So this may apply to things like magazines or books or things like that. The second, and this is a little more universally applicable, I'd say, is anytime you have double touch to zoom, if you double touch and then drag up or down with that same finger, so it's kind of like, touch, drag up and down, that should basically also be a zoom. So rather than zooming in by a fixed amount, say 50 or a 2x or whatever it is, double touch and drag up and down is kind of like a dynamic zoom. So I think if you drag, I forgot if it's drag up, it's zoom in or zoom out, but an example of this is Google Maps. So if you open up Google Maps right now, and this has been around for quite some time, if you open up Google Maps right now, double touch, drag up and down, I think up will zoom in, down will zoom out.
Yeah. It's in Chrome as well, and it's a great way because you can do similar to a kind of like a pinching gesture, but you can do it one-handed, so it's great.
Yeah, so yeah, that's actually how I discovered it. I was using Maps with one hand, and I was double touching a lot, and then I accidentally stumbled upon it. I was like, oh my god, this is the best thing ever. But yeah, if you're building something like this, then definitely use this. I will say that we don't have sample code available just yet, but I'll probably do an update to our gestures training class for this at some point.
No, the gesture detector in the support library is being updated to support this.
Excellent, even better. There you go.
We've written the code for you.
Awesome. So my change to the training class will be like 1 line of code or something like that. Awesome. Okay. Let's move on to screen recording.
So this is just nothing to change the way you have to design your applications, but we've made it a lot easier to capture video from the device. So I think in previous shows we've talked about having specialized hardware or certain devices which let you record the screen output in order to create really high quality product videos. But a new system feature in Android 4.4 called screen recording will let you do this via a simple command. So there's no on-device UI for actually doing this. This is kind of like a developer feature for producing these videos ahead of time rather than like a runtime user feature, as it were. So you simply execute this command written on screen, and this will record a 15-second, up to 15 seconds of video in kind of in full high definition, the full kind of screen resolution. And then you can just pull use the ADB pull command in order to kind of get that video file off of the device and onto your computer. So a really easy way to record kind of product videos. As a little pro tip, if you go into the settings and then developer settings section and enable show touches, as we have on this tablet here, you get these kind of like white circles, which goes really well with doing a screen recording. So you can produce high quality product videos without having fingers in the way and so forth.
I will say, I think we updated it to 3 minutes, or is it still 15 seconds? I think at some point we made a change to make it 3 minutes, but it's either 3 minutes or 15 seconds. One other thing we should, one other thing we should mention is that what we're doing right here with our own setup here, we're not using screen record. Again, screen record is not meant for live screencasting. It's really for recording video and then post processing or things like that. So it's really good for like things like your promotional video on Google Play. If you want to show a video of your app in use, this will make it tons easier. All right, last but not least, scenes and transitions.
Yeah, so scenes and transitions. So the animation framework in Android get some fantastic new additions in Android 4.4, and we're calling them scenes and transitions. So there's sort of two parts to this. The first is where you can essentially define scenes within your UI. This is sort of two different UI states for a particular screen. And then you can have the system actually calculate the animation to get from the first scene to the second scene. So this is it's a really neat addition. And the second part to this is you can actually go and modify a particular view group. So this is sort of talking more on the developer side. A view group is a collection of views within a particular screen, and make changes to those and have the system animate those changes as well. So it's definitely something to look into. If you want to get more involved inside the animation side of Android. For developers, there's the Android.transition manager that you should go look at to get more information about this. And if you're familiar with Keynote's sort of magic move animation, which sort of lets you morph sort of an object from one portion of the screen into another, it's sort of very similar to that. So just to sort of give you an idea of how it works or how it looks.
Yeah, and I think that the big thing here for designers is if you're talking to a developer and you're like, hey, I want these animations, these transitions to happen, and they're like, oh, I just can't do that, it's going to take too long. For earlier versions of Android, it does require a bit of work. It's definitely still doable. But if you're running Android 4.4 or later, I don't think there's an excuse anymore to not use this API. The great thing about this API is that it's so simple. I mean, the easiest form of this is one line of code. Mm-hmm. It's basically just kind of, I think it's begin delayed transition or something like that. And it basically says anytime you show or hide or resize or move things, automatically, adjust their bounds or animate their bounds or fade them in and fade them out. It's really awesome. So I think that for designers, make sure that you kind of press your developers to use this new API if they have any sort of concerns over the amount of time it would take to implement certain transitions.
And lastly, for developers, look for a dev bite from our animation expert, Chet Haas, which we live very shortly as well.
Yep. Okay, so that's it for what's new in Android 4.4 KitKat from a design standpoint. Watch out for all those dev bites that we talked about for developers. And we're looking to create a whole bunch of design bites on these topics as well over the coming weeks or months, hopefully weeks. So stay tuned for all that. Anyway, so see you next week or the week after or whatever. As always, I'm Roman Nurik.
See you later, guys. Adam Koch here.
Bye from Nick Butcher.